Imagine a single railroad company that could move freight seamlessly from the ports of Los Angeles to the ports of New York. No handoffs, no interchange delays, no switching carriers mid journey. That is the promise behind the proposed merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. It's a deal that would create the first single line transcontinental railroad in U.S. history. It would span more than 50,000 miles across 43 states and nearly 100 ports. Supporters say this could finally make rail a more serious challenger to long haul trucking, lowering costs and improving supply chain efficiency. But critics say it risks concentrating too much power in too few hands, in an industry where four railroads already control more than 90% of U.S. freight. Now, in January, regulators hit the reset button. The Surface Transportation Board, or STB, rejected the merger application outright, not because the deal is dead, but because, in the board's view, the companies didn't even clear the starting line. Today's episode of Art of Supply is about what this merger actually is, why it's so controversial, and what the STB's rejection tells us, or doesn't, about what's likely to happen next. Now, in this episode of Art of Supply, I'll cover what Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern are proposing and why it would be historically significant. I'll share the arguments for the merger, including efficiency, cost, and competition with other freight channels, as well as the arguments against it from organized labor, shippers, competitors, and policy advocates. And then finally, where the Objective Surface Transportation Board fits in and what the January 2026 rejection means. Now, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern confirmed in July of 2025 that they were in advanced talks about a potential merger. Now, they also cautioned at the time that those talks might not result in a deal. If completed, the transaction, which has been described by some sources as an $85 billion acquisition, would create the first coast-to-coast single-operator freight railroad in the United States. And as I said, these are big numbers: 50,000 route miles, 43 states, and 100 ports. Now, these numbers matter because the railroads don't just operate the trains. They own, build, and maintain the track infrastructure itself, something that gives them enormous control over routing, access, and investment decisions, but which also changes the requirements of their business model, especially when we're trying to compare it to something like trucking that's running on a state or federally managed highway system. Today, rail accounts for somewhere between 12 and 13% of all U.S. freight movement. So it's significant, but it's certainly not dominant. Proponents of the deal see this merger as one way to strengthen rail's role in the broader freight system, especially when they're competing against trucking. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern describe this proposal as the Great Connection. They've framed it as a way to strengthen U.S. supply chains, enhance competition, support long-term economic growth. And let's be honest, in between those lines, rail is an expensive business. These companies may need to band together in order to remain profitable and keep operating. According to the company's own materials about the proposed merger, the combined railroad would convert 10,000 existing lanes from interline service to single-line service, and, in their hopes, shift approximately 2 million truckloads from road to rail. Now, they've also said that they will, quote, protect all union jobs, but I think that's a difficult case to make given some of the changes that they say will result from the deal. Supporters also point to cost and efficiency comparisons. According to the American Action Forum, the average cost per net ton by truck is about $215. The same cost per net ton by rail is $70. So it's a massive difference in cost. The American Action Forum also argues that this merger would mirror the logic behind the STB's approval of the Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern merger. That was characterized as an end-to-end combination that eliminated interchanges rather than one that reduced head-to-head competition. And of course, there are defensive arguments embedded in here. Other players in the space are going to be affected. If Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern merge, competitors like BNSF and CSX could feel pressured to do the same. Some people see this consolidation as inevitable, and as a result, they argue that it's better to manage it deliberately rather than let it happen and try to get involved after the fact. Now, there are groups out there that are very vocally opposed to this merger. The Teamsters Rail Conference represents roughly 20,000 Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern employees, and they have come out strongly against this deal. Now, side point, I love it when the Teamsters enter a supply chain story because you know they're going to bring the drama and they're going to bring the color. Now, at the same time, the Teamsters have some valid concerns and points here. First and foremost, safety. In a lot of their public statements coming out against this merger, they've talked about not just widespread safety issues, meaning injuries, but fatalities. They have real concerns. Of course, workforce shortages and demand always come into this sort of thing. But the Teamsters have also alleged that the company used embargoes to mask operational problems. They've alleged that, quote, Union Pacific has used excessive embargoes, which are meant to ease congestion when rail networks are backed up, to disguise their workforce shortages. So, in other words, they're saying, sure, if there's congestion, you should be using more man hours. You should be using more labor to clear that up. Instead, Union Pacific has made use of embargoes to allow that congestion to work itself out more gradually. The Surface Transportation Board has itself come out and made statements or expressed concerns about Union Pacific's lack of transparency on the embargo usage. They've stated, quote, rarely has a rail carrier engaged in such delay and obfuscation in response to the board's request for information. I mean, we can't have obfuscation. That's serious. Now, there are other concerns here as well, and multiple advocacy groups have argued that the merger would further concentrate power in an industry that's already very consolidated. A rail reform brief claims that the number of Class 1 railroads has fallen by 70% over the last 40 years. And as I mentioned, 4 of these Class 1 or mega railroads currently control 90% of U.S. freight traffic. That same document warns that a Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger could eliminate remaining rail-to-rail competition, may end up increasing shipper costs, and could reduce routing options as well as negotiating leverage. Another policy brief, titled The New Railroad Barons, frames the U.S. rail system as 2 regional duopolies split roughly by the Mississippi River. This brief argues that the merger could trigger a second mega deal, resulting in a national duopoly, even more concentration. That brief quotes former Norfolk Southern CEO Wick Morwin as saying, a well-executive large railroad merger is an oxymoron. Every rail merger of significant size has been extremely disruptive for a period of time. And if having the Teamsters involved and competitive concentration risk highlighted wasn't enough, don't worry, here comes the federal government. In November of 2025, 18 U.S. senators sent a bipartisan letter urging the STB to conduct a rigorous review of the proposed merger. Their letter emphasized risks to agricultural producers that are reliant on rail for transportation, long-term competition concerns, and overall network fluidity and routing flexibility. Those 18 senators cited the 1996 Union Pacific Southern Pacific merger as a cautionary tale. They point to resulting worker fatalities, prolonged service disruptions, and an estimated $4 billion economic impact. Academic commentary referenced in the Senate article notes that despite decades of consolidation, carload trip times and utilization actually haven't changed all that much. And it raises real questions about whether scale achieved through combination would actually deliver any of the promised efficiency gains. Now, it's not just the senators that are representing the federal government in this. There's also the Surface Transportation Board. They are supposed to be the neutral gatekeeper, And they're tasked with applying post 2001 mega merger rules that require a merger to prove that it will serve the public interest, that it will enhance rather than merely preserve competition. Now, those rules remained largely untested for a full scale Class 1 merger of this size. Ironically, some of those rules were clarified the day after Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern announced their intent to merge. In January, the STB unanimously rejected the UP-NS merger application as being incomplete, and this generated a whole additional round of press coverage. The board cited missing elements, such as post merger market share projections, required market impact analyses, and reiterated that the two rail companies have to demonstrate an understanding that their planned merger would have on the market, as well as the impact it would have on the whole system, nationally and regionally. I think the important thing here, and it was interesting in all of the reactions to that rejection from the STB, is that the rejection was, quote, without prejudice. That means that it was a procedural rejection, not one based on the deal's merits. It's as simple as somebody went down a checklist and said, here are all of the things that need to be in this deal, and some of the things that needed to be there were not. As Railway Age reported, the STB emphasized that, quote, any railroad combination entails a risk that the merged carrier would acquire and exploit increased market power. Rail Passengers Association President Jim Matthews underscored that federal law requires rejection of incomplete applications. Period. There's nothing more to talk about. And yet, in response to that rejection, everyone from the Teamsters to railway competitors celebrated the paperwork rejection, indicating that maybe it means more than it actually does in the big picture, or maybe just looking for good press. Now, what happens next is a little bit uncertain, especially from a timeline standpoint. We know that Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern intend to refile a revised application, and that will have to go through another completeness review before they get to a more material evaluation. The STB timelines suggest that the whole review process is probably going to take somewhere about 2 years, although that may stretch with some of these procedural rejections, as well as environmental reviews and public hearings. So that timeline is already pushing any final decision well into 2027, even if there aren't further setbacks. The longer this all plays out, the more second-order effects come into view. Other railways may make decisions about competitive positioning or their own mergers. Capital investment decisions may be deferred as the different organizations wait to find out if they'll be paying for them together or separately. And of course, shippers and organized labor remain waiting. So this isn't a systemic failure. It's just what active governance looks like in a highly concentrated, infrastructure-heavy industry. But it's going to require a little bit of patience before we get clarity. Now, my main takeaways here are these. This merger is about more than just two railroads. It's about how much concentration the freight system can absorb without losing various types of resilience. The STB's rejection, importantly, does not kill this deal, but it does raise the bar, signaling that assumptions about efficiency and competition have to be proven and articulated, not just promised or teased. For shippers, especially those in agriculture and bulk commodities, this is not an abstract risk. This is about daily routing options, negotiating leverage, and service recovery when things go wrong. For procurement and supply chain leaders, it's a reminder that scale can cut both ways. Efficiency gains can introduce fragility, and integration can amplify, not erase, operational risk. The outcome here, although it seems likely the merger will eventually go through, still isn't predetermined. Confidence could build or reverse quickly depending on how the next phase unfolds. For now, pack your patience. Uncertainty is going to be a feature, not a bug of this process, and navigating it remains part of our jobs.